Welcome to LSNTV. I'm Steve Jalsovac, co-founder of LifeSite News. And today, in this program, we're going to address the history of the life, family, and faith developments in Canada through the memories and experiences of one of Canada's leading pro-life heroes. Let me give you first a little bit of background. Abortion was legalized in 1973 in the United States through the infamous Roe v. Wade decision. But in Canada, the situation was different. In Canada, abortion was legalized through the omnibus bill of Marxist Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau through the infamous C-150 omnibus bill. And that also decriminalized homosexuality, allowed for contraception, and liberalized divorce, and many other things. There is a story to all that, and we'll get into it. Canada was a strongly Christian, primarily Catholic nation that sent large numbers of missionaries around the world, and most of them came from the province of Quebec, which was a fervently French Catholic province. Then came what we call the Quiet Revolution in Quebec against the excessive control of the Catholic Church over the everyday life of Quebecers. That in turn led to a rapid falling away from the faith and eventual dramatic changes of Canada into a far more secular nation, the nation that we have today. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, father of the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, played a very large role in this negative transformation. The rest is history, and a Canada that has been having a sadly negative influence on the world since that time on the issues that we most report on in LifeSite News. Today, I have the honor and privilege of discussing these developments with the President Emeritus of Campaign Life Coalition, Jim Hughes, with whom I've worked for over the past 40 years. I can't think of anyone better to discuss this incredible history than Jim. He played a leading role for most of its years, and together with him, we're going to share with you a lot of astonishing details and stories about what occurred during those historic years. I'm sure that many watching this interview are going to learn a lot of fascinating information and stories about amazing people that you are not aware of. And I hope that through this, you'll come to appreciate the extraordinary efforts and battles engaged in by Canadians, American, and other pro-life heroes during those years. We will also discuss many very important behind-the-scenes developments that I suspect most of you are not aware of, but really should know about. Welcome to LSNTV, Jim.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
Well, here we are, November 2023, about 40 years after we first met. Just in general, what do you think and feel when I say that we're going to go over what happened and all that you were involved in those many years?
Well, it's, yes. Well, I started to write down a number of salient points, and I thought, oh, this is a good one. And finally, I had a list of about 80 different things, and I thought, well, now every one of them will take about 10 minutes. So, yes, 800 hours or minutes that we'll be doing this, and this is going to be a daunting task for sure. It is.
Well, there's a lot to tell.
Absolutely.
That probably most people aren't aware of.
Yes, most people see things only as the media would point out to them. And the media, of course, is not going to tell them all the truth. Yeah. That's why we're here, and that's why all these pro-life organizations have done an outstanding job of alerting people to the dangers that life and family are taking.
When I first started with Campaign Life Coalition, I was very green. And I started to learn, as Jim is well aware. And Jim started to tell me a few things that were behind the scenes information, confidential information, and I just didn't believe him. And then over the next 3 years, I got very involved in Campaign Life Coalition and the pro-life movement, and I learned it was actually true. And actually the situation was much more, I wouldn't say necessarily worse, but much more complicated than I ever dreamed of. And he told me a lot of things that he has not been telling the rest of the public, because the rest of the public was not prepared to listen to what he had to tell them. It took years and time for him to learn, for the public to accept those things. So, Jim, how did you first get involved in the pro-life movement?
Well, I was asleep one day, and my wife, my wife, who was a registered nurse at the time, said, "You got to do something about this abortion issue." And I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "I want you to come to the Canadian National Exhibition, which is an exposition, and see this slide presentation being presented by Toronto Right to Life." So I said, "Sure, whatever." So we went down to the X, and I couldn't believe this when I saw this slide presentation. I couldn't believe that you could kill a child, a preborn child, right up until the time it would be born. And there was no legislation to stop it as a result of the 1969 legislation. That all changed too in 1988 when the Supreme Court threw out the previous legislation, and it was Katie bar the door. You could do anything you wanted.
Yeah, all the restrictions were removed.
Yeah, all the restrictions were removed. So back then, after I saw this presentation, I said to my wife, well, she said, why don't you volunteer to help with this? So the following year, I volunteered to put this show on myself at the exhibition. And then from there, I went off to see the Tiniest Humans Conference at the big hotel in Toronto.
What year was that?
That was about 1975, maybe,
Wow.
1975.
Yeah.
But before that, I had been elected to the Archdiocesan Pastoral Council, a Catholic thing, under the late Archbishop Philip Pocock. And in 1973, the two of us were discussing an issue he wanted to bring forward to the council, made up of 28 lay people, approximately. And he said, I want to withdraw Catholic Charities from the United Way campaign. And I said, why would you ever want to do that? He said, they've decided to include Planned Parenthood in the appeal. And I said, what's wrong with Planned Parenthood? I never heard of them. And he said, they're the world's largest abortion referral agency. And I said, oh, my heavens, I didn't know that. He said, how do you think the lay people will take to this? And I said, how did the priest council take to it? He was very silent, never answered. And then who joined us was a priest from the St. Augustine Seminary, Aloysius Ambrosic. And so I looked at him, and he looked at the ground as well and didn't answer. And I said, oh, okay. So he said, how do you think the lay people will take this? I said, well, if you lay it out for them the way you laid it out for me, I think they'll be very supportive. So he brought up the issue, and all 28 people supported what he was going to do. And so when he announced it, everybody had a bird and said, oh, you're never going to get the money you need for these Catholic charities if you withdraw. Well, not only did the Share Life campaign bring in more, but they brought in twice or three times the amount they were getting through the United Way campaign.
So the people wanted this.
People wanted it, yeah. People were right behind him.
But you've had such a passion for this work. And you saw those photographs in at the CNE, which I did as well, and that was what converted me to pro-life. But you had another motivation for getting involved in pro-life, something very personal.
Well, we lost two of our first three children that were born. And the first one, I didn't let it all hang out. I was the knight on the charger, holding everybody else together. And then finally it hit me, and I went to a shrink for 2 years. Well, he tried to help me get through it all, and I did. And I was walking along the boardwalk, which runs along the top of Lake Ontario in the Toronto area, and it was a sunny day, and I was pushing in the stroller my second child, and all of a sudden I thought, oh no, God loves me, and I love God, and what am I worried about? And the child's with God. And so I turned around and went back home, returned a number of phone calls that I was putting off, and went back to doing my work. And it was interesting then when it happened with the third child. I didn't pretend I was a knight on a white charger. I let it all hang out like a normal person would do. And then I got over that very quickly. But they always remained in my conscience or whatever. So when I'm at church services, I thank God for my children, and I name the two that I lost as well as the ones that survived and were blessed to have. And then with the 6 grandchildren we had, then I praised God all the time for that too. So it's been a wonderful thing because they're part and parcel of our family, despite the fact that we didn't get to enjoy the time with them when they were here on earth.
So many of the people that are involved in pro-life in a very big way, they have some kind of a backstory.
Everybody's got one. Young people in the Campaign Life Coalition office there last summer, they said to me, Mr. Hughes, you don't understand. We all have problems. And I laughed like heck, and I said, everybody here has got them. Everybody carries their own little cross. and it's just that they've learned how to cope with them, and you'll be able to cope with them too. And they said, oh, that's interesting. Oh, okay. So it's like that's what life's all about, is handling all these challenges.
Well, it seems that people are called to the pro-life movement. They don't really make the decision themselves. Something calls them to it. Would you agree with that?
The last prayer I say every morning is, Lord, thank you for allowing me to do your work today. Mm-hmm. When I retired as the chair of Campaign Life Coalition after 40 years, I continued to do the work on a full-time basis. But at my church, a woman approached me and she said, how does it feel to have wasted 40 years of your life?
Oh, my.
And I thought, what? She said, 40 years and you didn't accomplish anything. I said, every day was a gift from God to be able to do this work. And I leave it up to him. I go and do the best I can, and any judgment on how successful or negative my actions were, it's up to him. He'll judge them. And that's what's kept me going. Together with so many wonderful people I've met in the pro-life movement, not just in Canada, but in the United States and abroad. And it's been absolutely a mind-blowing thing where you get this adrenaline every day thinking, hey, I'm not alone. There's this army of people out there who feel the same way I do about the issues, and it's wonderful to be part of it. So when they say, well, Jim Hughes, you did this, I said, I didn't do anything by myself. No. There was an army of people that were doing it. Brilliant people, not just me. I come from Charlie Lunchpail and Mary Washerwoman, and that's where I come from. That's my background. And so it's a joy to be able to do it.
When you first started, what did your wife tell you about how long you would be involved in this?
My wife said, why don't you take 2 years off from your work and do this?
What was your work and how much money were you making?
Well, in those days, the last 2 years, I made over $100,000 in each of those
back
2
then,
years.
in 1970.
1978.
That was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money. And I said, okay, I'll do it. So I used the money that I had saved and pumped it into things like fax machines. And people might know, what's a fax machine? Well, we had a method of communicating on a fast basis was this machine that was hooked up to your phone, and you were able to transmit information to various areas.
People don't know what a fax machine is anymore.
No, they don't know what it is. And I still have one, by the way, and I find it very effective. So all of a sudden it was 5 years and 10 years, and when it got to be about 40 years, my wife said, I suggested you do this for 2 years, not 40 years. And now you're getting older. I said, yes, but I turned over the reins of responsibility to a very competent person and a competent team of people to do the work. But I can't walk away from it now because there's so much evil still out there in the world. And I feel if God comes to call me tomorrow, I don't want him to find me sitting on my duff while all this terrible stuff is happening. I want him to find me still doing battle. And all this stuff too, the most important thing and the fundamental thing is prayer. If I didn't have that prayer that helped me focus on this whole thing, it wouldn't have worked. I would have left after a very short period of time. But when I saw all the other people around me, Catholics and evangelicals and non-evangelical Christians and whatnot, we almost had a terrible law after 1988. And a man who didn't believe in God was in my office, and he said to me, why are you so negative? He said, why don't you turn your God power on this? And I said, what? He said, turn your God power on it. I said, oh, you're right, I didn't do that. So after we had lost what appeared to be the final battle in the House of Commons in Canada, and it went on to the Senate.
Which bill was that?
That was Bill C-43.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So we went to Ottawa.
Can you explain the bill?
Bill C-43 was an attempt by the Conservative government at the time,
Brian Mulroney.
Brian Mulroney's government, to bring in legislation. But when we examined it all, and it wasn't just me, it was a whole team of people examining it.
Across Canada.
Across Canada. And Gwen Landolt was our lawyer at the time, and she was a brilliant lawyer. She said, this is not going to protect any children whatsoever. It's a sham, it's a ruse. And even the person that was leading the conservative pro-life caucus at the time voted in favor of this legislation because he said, well, at least women in the northern part of British Columbia won't, that's at the Pacific province in Canada, they won't have to travel down to Vancouver to have abortions. They can do it on the phone, and they can have midwives doing it and all sorts of stuff. So the legislation was defeated in the Senate because we lobbied the Senate, and their vote ended in a tie. And because it was a tie, the bill died.
Most people don't realize that legislation would have allowed non-physicians to commit abortions.
Absolutely.
And it would have caused an even greater explosion of abortions.
And it would have given people the impression that there was pro-life legislation in place when, in fact, there was none. And so people attacked us over that, said, well, it would have been something. And even the clergy attacked us at times, the hierarchy, saying, you know, it's your fault that we don't have a piece of legislation. I pointed out to them, wait a minute, God told Moses, thou shalt not kill. Are you telling me that the hierarchy is saying, well, that's thou shalt not kill after 15 weeks or 21 weeks of gestation or whatever? That's really strange that you would take that position. Here are the lay people saying no to abortion, never. And by the same token, we looked out for the women who were distressed and pregnant, and we tried to offer help. We helped set up Aid to Women in Toronto. We worked with Sisters of Life when they were finally invited to come to Canada, and they're doing fantastic work. There's several groups of nuns working at this, several Christian groups that are working, helping women who are distressed and pregnant, and others that are helping women that have had abortions. In fact, in our office in Toronto, we had at times 3 women that have had abortions that worked for us.
Yeah.
And we were all together because, you see, we realized that God created each one of us in his own image and likeness. So even with the most notorious abortionist, we could still have a conversation. And I did have a conversation with Canada's leading abortionist.
And one of the United States leading abortionists as well.
Bernard Nathanson and I sat in a coffee shop in Washington at one point, and he said to me, I was walking through the streets of New York. It was a hot, hot day, so humid. And then I saw this St. Patrick's Cathedral there, and I thought, I bet you it's cool in there. So he went inside, and he sat in the back of the church, and there was a church service going on. And at one point, the 2 people in front of me, a young man and young woman, turned to me and said, the peace of Christ, Dr. Nathanson. They knew who I was. They knew what I did for a living. He said, I stumbled out of there and thought, what the heck is this? Well, Bernard Nathanson went from being an atheistic Jew to being a pro-lifer. And before he died, he was very much in all the different court cases that were being held. He appeared as a witness for the pro-life side and for the pro-life doctors and whatnot. And it was a great relationship we had.
And he produced some incredible movies as well.
He had some, I can't even remember the names of them now.
Silent Scream.
Silent Scream, and what's the next one? The other one? I can't remember.
Yeah, I can't remember either.
And then he came out with one just after he became a Catholic. He talked about the grace of God or something like that propelled him into the arms of the pro-life movement. And keep in mind that he and Betty Friedan and Larry Lader started the pro-abortion movement in the United States.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, they came up with terms such as choice,
yeah.
and because they knew that God created people with a reason and free will. And so, wow, why not choice? That's perfect. And so as a result of that, so many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of children were killed in the United States and Canada. Millions, in fact, now in Canada, and probably 10 times that number in the United States. And in the end, we got along extremely well, had a very strong friendship. As a matter of fact, one TV station in Canada wanted me to come on the program with abortionist Henry Morgentaler. And I thought about it, and I had agreed to it. And then I thought about it and said, why not have one of the people that started the abortion movement come and debate Henry Morgentaler? So I phoned Bernie Nathanson in New York, and I said, would you be interested in debate? Yes, I will. I'll be there. So I called the television station. I said, I got news for you. I've got a replacement, and they couldn't believe that we had Bernie Nathanson coming up. So that program is still available out there, the debate between Morgentaler and Nathanson. But with Henry Morgentaler...
That was on CHCH TV in Hamilton?
It was on Hamilton TV station.
Yeah.
Well, by the way, when I approached the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and CTV to run the commercials, the pro-life commercials, they said no. The CTV guy said to me that it's pornographic, showing the journey of a child in the womb. No pictures of, no graphic images or anything, just the child himself or herself in the womb. No. So I went to CHCH in Hamilton, and they took it on. So they were very fair.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. They were very fair and were prepared to present the truth.
So even back then there was censorship.
Oh my heavens, it was awful.
Yeah.
And back then, don't forget, when we wanted to get a press release out, we got 3 cars with 2 people in each one, going in every different direction to the radio stations and the TV stations, the newspapers.
There was no internet?
No internet. You had to do all this thing, and it was very effective, as a matter of fact. And press conferences that we would hold were well attended. I can still remember when Bernie Nathanson was in Toronto for a press conference at the old Sutton Place Hotel, which doesn't exist anymore. And he was really happy. He said, oh, there were 6 television cameras there, and there were all these microphones on the desk. And I said, yeah, well, they're not going to report it. And he said, oh, come on, you're being negative, Jim. I said, okay. So the next day, he said, when I picked him up to drive him to the airport, he said, was there any coverage? I said, well, in a perhaps a thimbleful, that's all you got.
Yeah.
They were all there because they knew that you were one of the founders of the abortion movement in the United States, but they weren't really interested in where you were now, over in the pro-life side. So then Henry Morgentaler, the last time I saw him in person, was at a restaurant in downtown Toronto. And I was there with 2 associates. It was my birthday, and they had decided to take me out to my favorite restaurant downtown for lunch. And there he was sitting at another table. Now, the restaurant was packed, but I saw him and nodded to him and sat down and ordered my food. And when I had finished, he came over. I could sense him standing behind me. So I stood up and I said, so how are you, Henry? And he said, well, not bad for an old man, but I got old man ailments, arthritis and all this sort of stuff. So I introduced him to my seatmates. And after a little chat, he said, did anybody ever tell you you do a good job on TV? I said, maybe my mother one time, but otherwise, she said to me one time, well, how come you look so big on TV? I said, oh, it's the television cameras. And she said, what do? Eat them? So anyway, Morgentaler then laughed. And as he was leaving the restaurant, I was only 2 tables away from the door, and I said, hey, Henry. And so he turned around and I said, don't forget. And he smiled. I said, I'm still praying for you. And he said, thank you. And off he went. And then perhaps 2 years later, it became known that the late-term abortions were being sent to George Tiller, the killer in Wichita, Kansas, and other places. And Henry came out in public and said, that's tantamount to baby killing. I terminate pregnancies before they become human beings. Right. So interesting how it all works out,
But he was in favor of late term prior to that. Was that
Prior
correct?
to that, he was in favor of late-term abortions, but now his position had changed, and he no longer did late-term abortions. In fact, I guess he was denying that he ever did them in the first place.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's an interesting situation when you meet former abortionists, when you meet former employees of Planned Parenthood.
Abby Johnson.
Abby Johnson, I met her in a tent in Washington, D.C. at their big March for Life, and I was waiting to be interviewed by EWTN, and I introduced myself to her. I said, "So where are you?" And she said, "Well, I used to work for Planned Parenthood." I said, "Wow, that's terrific." And so we met the first time she came out in public with this. And I've seen her many times since then, and she's done wonderful work and influenced a number of people and educated people as to what's going on, really. So it's been, so far, it's been a wonderful life.
How did your views change or develop as time went on from the beginning? So you had your ideas about abortion, but of course there was a lot that you didn't know at the beginning.
In the beginning, when they elected me chairman of Campaign Life Coalition Toronto, it was actually just Campaign Life Toronto at the time. And so there were requests for interviews, and I refused to do them. I had other people do them because I was fearful that some woman watching this interview, I would mess up somehow because I didn't know the issue so well. And I would have other people that had much more experience do the interviews. And so it was only after the first year that I actually began doing interviews when they were requested. What I didn't understand was the wisdom of all of these different people. Miss Winifred Prestwich, retired vice principal of an exclusive girls' school, Havergal College. Wow, she just was so full of knowledge. And so I acted like I was a sponge, and I listened to all of this that was going on. We had a wonderful lawyer by the name of Gwen Landolt who could read the law really well. And so as a lawyer, she had worked for the federal government at one point. She was from British Columbia on the Pacific coast, and Laura MacArthur, who was a farm girl from New Brunswick on the east coast, the Atlantic coast. And so it was these two ladies that convinced me after this Tiniest Human conference they had in Toronto with Professor Jerome Lejeune and Professor Dr. William Liley from New Zealand.
Yeah.
And he was the person that discovered the extra chromosome in children with Down syndrome.
Was that Lejeune? Or?
Was Lejeune that developed that, and it was Liley who developed the ultrasound. He and others came up with ultrasound, and he said to me, "I'm just fearful that this discovery that we've made doesn't influence the pro-abortion movement." And of course it did. And now women are denied the looking at their child before they choose to kill it because it would affect the money that was being earned by killing children before birth.
Yeah. Yeah, these were amazing people that you worked with in those early years and later years. And then in time, what were the things that especially astonished you to learn that you didn't know as time went on?
I expected that the churches would be in the forefront battling abortion, and I was shocked to find that they weren't there. They all had exceptions. In fact, when I first met Laura MacArthur, the president of Toronto Right to Life, she said, "You're not a compromiser, are you?" And I said, "No." She said, "I can't stand compromisers. How do you compromise the life of a child before birth?" And I said, "Beats me, I don't know." And so she and Gwen Landolt suggested to me that I join this newly formed group, Campaign Life. It was formed in Winnipeg, Manitoba on May the 25th, 1978, and it came to Toronto on October the 7th, 1978. So they said, "Come on to the meeting." So I went there and I found about 200 people there, maybe 300 people, and I knew a lot of them. And so I saw this pro-life organization that was going to work in the political realm, and they needed somebody to spearhead that. And I said, well, okay, so that's what I wound up doing. I wound up spearheading that. And I thought, where am I going to get the money for this? I was a fundraiser, so what do I do now? So I said to the people, there were 200 people on our mailing list, and I said, give me the names of people you send Christmas cards to. And that 200 went up to 8,000 just by that little thing. Back in those days, people sent dozens and dozens. I sent 100 Christmas cards a year back then. So I thought of that, and all of a sudden we had this whole group of people out there, hundreds of people ready to support us, and it went very well from there. And then as a fundraiser, I said, look, I got these Christmas candles we can sell. So we sold Christmas candles, and that helped us. And then we decided to sell Christmas cakes, and made by the monks in
Orangeville?
Orangeville. They were originally, and now they're in Quebec. And so one year we made $100,000 selling Christmas cakes.
Yeah.
So then other people, detractors, said, well, all they do is sell cakes. But in the meantime, we were qualifying candidates who wanted to run politically, and we had a team of 3 that looked at every candidate, had local people in the other provinces. We had Campaign Life Coalition provincial units right across the country, and they did the heavy lifting at the grassroots level and told us about all these different people. Back in those days, we decided we had to qualify the candidates. We couldn't vote for people that would be in favor of killing children, preborn children. So we had a team of 3 in the Toronto office, in the head office, and we had provincial leaders right across the country who did the heavy lifting, qualifying candidates, finding out where the candidates stood on the issues.
How did we do that qualification?
Well, the first thing was Father Ian Boyd of the Basilian Fathers was the one that drafted our first questionnaire. And the questionnaire was, do you believe that abortion should be wrong in every case, etc.? And will you support legislation to cut off any funding to organizations that promote abortion? And so we started with that. It was, painstaking work. It took forever to complete it all. And then we would produce in the interim newspaper, which we started in 1983, we would produce a list of every riding in the federal riding in the country and tell the people where everybody stood on the issues.
How many of those papers did you publish, print?
Thousands of them.
Hundreds of thousands. Maybe.
Hundreds of thousands, perhaps. But the interesting thing is, slowly that vehicle died because the government brought in new regulations all the time. For instance, we used to do a phone call to people in a given riding and say, here we are from Campaign Life Coalition. Here we wanted to tell you which candidates are on side and whatnot. And so the government brought in legislation that said, well, you can't do this anymore because we said these are our supporters. They're not some mailing list that means nothing to anybody. But these are our own people. We're trying to alert them. No, you can't do that anymore. And so basically they've cut us down to where we still continue to do it.
They considered it supporting the campaigns for individual candidates, and therefore that was illegal.
That's correct.
In their minds.
In their minds, yeah. But, in reality, it was all a question, how do we shut these people up?
That's right.
And how do we stop them from getting the information? Because all of this is making sure they don't know the truth.
We had candidates come into the office, Campaign Life Coalition office, and we qualified them right there. What are some of the things that we did when that happened?
Well, it was quite interesting because people were calling us and saying, I've got somebody here that I think you should talk to. We had an MP one time that came in, you could smoke indoors then, and he was chain smoking, and he said, it was from another province, and he said, have you ever been to my office? I said, yeah, I've been there. And he said, my secretary or my assistant. I said, yeah, a lovely young girl. He said, that's my daughter. He said, I was married before and I divorced my wife because she wouldn't have an abortion. And I said, oh, that's too bad. He said, that's the daughter that she wouldn't abort. And I said, oh my God, does that young woman know that? And he said, no. My wife has been kind enough not to tell her. She knows that she's my daughter, of course, but she wouldn't tell her that our marriage broke up because I wouldn't agree to an abortion. So all kinds of...
But you showed certain films to candidates who wanted our support. And what happened then?
In most cases, they, even if they were wishy-washy on the issue, they saw the truth of what this was all about, and they would proclaim that they were pro-life. One who's still on our national board, former member of Parliament, in the beginning he wasn't totally on side. We met him two of us met him at a downtown Toronto restaurant, and he went on and on about where he was, and there were two things that he objected to, and I said, well, if I give you the information on this to show you that you're wrong, will you take a look at it? And he said, sure, I will. Well, the other person that I was with, who was a hot-headed Scotsman, said, let's get out of here, he's not pro-life. I said, let's just continue to work with him. Let's be patient. And in the end, he got the material and said, I'm now on side. He said, I agree totally with where you are. And so all kinds of different things like that happened. Hundreds of times those things happened. I was in the province of Newfoundland, which is our furthest Atlantic province, and I was giving a talk there in the wintertime, and a guy a man in a hockey jacket, a windbreaker, came up to me afterwards and said, I'm interested in running for office. And I said, oh yeah, with which party? And so he told me the Liberal Party. So I took his name down and whatnot, and I passed it on. He eventually got the nomination, got elected, and is still in the House of Commons. Unfortunately, he's not on our side anymore. But that happened on many different occasions where people would say, well, I was pro-life. The members of Parliament would say, I was pro-life, but I smartened up. Well, they smartened up, so-called, because a good Christian man, they thought, who was a senator, went around to them and said, I can get you on committees and everything as long as you move away from your pro-life position. As long as if you become pro-choice on abortion, I can get you on all kinds of committees, which brings in, the bucks, because it all comes down to the bucks. And that was hard to take because it happened to so many people that I know. Because the pressure to conform to this, to the hierarchy, if it were the hierarchy in politics and everything else.
And the church.
It just is unbelievable. And we had churchmen of all different denominations that would be supporting candidates that were pro-abortion. And when we would point this out to them, and they say, oh, no, and we would show them the proof, and then they got mad at us because we told them, now what are they going to do? They're now in a position where this member of their congregation, they're supporting them, and these people are pro-abortion.
So the relationship they considered more important than the lives of the unborn. Would that be correct or not?
Well, I don't want to be too hard on anybody. Because the issue, when you explain part of the issue to somebody, well, it's part of the woman's body. I said, oh, how many women do you know that have two blood types? Huh? Yeah, frequently the child has a different blood type than the mother. You mean there's women out there that have two blood types? We don't know. Oh my, what a scientific explosion this will be now. Two types of blood. Oh, you didn't like that. How about that? Well, this woman says that it's part of her body. I said, oh, get her to show you her umbilical cord. And all sorts of different things like that. But it's hard to be judgmental. It's like a woman that comes to you and says, like, you probably won't like me very much, but I've had an abortion. I said, oh, I like you, and I love you because you were created just as I was. I didn't mean to do it. I said, yeah, I know. You're looking for a job? Yeah, come on in and fill out an application. So at one point, there were three women there that had had abortions that were working for us.
Yeah.
So we didn't judge them. And we realized how difficult it was for people to get the knowledge. I can still remember somebody attacking me outside an abortuary because he said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "We're protesting abortion going on next door." He said, "Why weren't you here last week when my girlfriend went in and aborted our child?" I said, "I'm sorry. I could only get here certain times, and there mustn't have been anybody here." He said, "There was nobody here, and she aborted our child." Oh my heavens.
Yeah.
So you carry those things out and say, "Oh my heavens." You talk to people on the phone who would call in, and they would be looking for help, and you'd say, "Well, I have a team of women here who will talk to you." "No, we want to talk to you." And okay, fine. And then they'd go away, and you'd figure that maybe, well, I can remember on one occasion there was a Catholic school teacher in training, and we found out that she was going for an abortion. And so I called the bishop and I said, "Listen, this girl's going for an abortion. We're going to try to talk her out of it. And if we fail, I don't want her getting fired or anything like that." And said, "Oh no, it won't happen. We'll hold up our end of it." But in fact, she got the abortion, and they were going to throw her out. Today they would probably applaud her, but back then it was a different story.
Well, back in those days, Parliament actually had quite a lot of pro-life members in it. At the federal level, less so at the provincial level.
Half the federal caucus were liberals who were pro-life.
Yeah. And you had a lot of regular communications with them. You could go into their offices and lobby them and keep them informed. What's the situation today compared to then?
Well, in the late 1980s, I think it was, we started the Parliamentary Pro-Life Caucus.
Oh, yeah.
And I went to Elsie Wayne, who was a Conservative member of Parliament, the only one at the time, Jason Kenney from the newly formed Reform Party, and Tom Wappel from the Liberal Party. And the three of them agreed to join this pro-life caucus as co-chairs. So the three of them were co-chairs who each month a different one would chair the meetings. Yeah. But we were running them before we got the three of them. We had various MPs and senators chair these meetings at downtown hotels in Ottawa. And we had the Business for Life, which had been formed around the same time. They paid for all the meals, and they paid for all of that. So
for how many years did they pay for that?
They were still paying for it up till about 5 years ago, when
my goodness,
the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, decided that no pro-lifer will be allowed to run for his party unless they were prepared to accept the pro-abortion philosophy. So as a result of that, we backed off. There's a group there that calls themselves the Parliamentary Pro-Life Caucus, but they're all conservatives, and so it's like the conservative pro-life caucus.
Yeah,
and
kind of defeated the purpose of the original caucus.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was wonderful to be able to sit down with liberal and conservatives in the same room, who had this fundamental agreement on human life. And it was wonderful to have these discussions with them, propose different types of legislation, etc., that this one would present over here so that the party in power could say, well, it's over there on that side. But it was really a collaboration of the two parties that were there.
How many were the most number at the March for Life that actually came out onto the steps of Parliament and each gave a short speech?
A couple of dozen anyway.
Yeah.
And it was wonderful that with all this cooperation. But the powers that be, the people that were orchestrating this anti-life movement, anti-family movement, who want to remove parents as their prime educators of their children and whatnot, these people had the power, and they saw to it that there would be no major opposition. I can remember the Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien saying at one point, "You tell the white-bearded guy in Toronto he doesn't run the Liberal Party. I do." And at that point, he parachuted 5 candidates into ridings where we had pro-lifers ready to win their nominations. And so 5 Liberal candidates that we had lined up were replaced by 5 pro-aborts, including a retired Catholic school principal who ran against the solid.
So he overrode the local riding association, which represented the local voters in many ways who were of that party.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're doing it. They're still doing it now because the candidates have to go through a process, and a committee determines whether or not they will be allowed to run for that nomination. And they frequently get rid of solid pro-lifers because they think there'll be an albatross to the party winning.
Even Preston Manning did that eventually.
Preston Manning was a good man. He was the head of the Reform Party, etc. And I had the good fortune to have dinner with him at the Stornoway, the opposition leader's home in Ottawa. And he said that he was going to be having a town hall in Calgary, Alberta, his riding, and on euthanasia. And I said, "Oh, wait a minute. Have you prepared the people for this? Have you had speakers in to talk about it?" "Oh, no, I know all the people of my riding and whatnot. I know them. They wouldn't be pro-euthanasia." I said, "I'm telling you right now, don't do it unless you educate them first." And so I saw maybe a month or so later. I said, "How did that go?" He said, "I was shocked. They were all pro-euthanasia." I said, "Because you didn't educate them on the issue. That was important." When we did a survey one time with the late Senator Stanley Hydash of the Liberal Party, we had a wealthy supporter, a wealthy donor, paid for the survey across Canada. And the people on the other side began screaming, "This is not fair," because he, as a medical doctor, explained to people what abortion was all about. The majority of people that responded, a slight majority of people that responded, were pro-life.
Yeah.
As a result of the survey, they understood what the issue was. And they called for his resignation and all kinds of stuff, suggesting that he had used government money to do this, but he hadn't. It all came from a private donor.
Yeah.
But poor Stan Hydash, he was all uptight because he couldn't believe that we were having such a difficulty with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church on these things. He said, "Well, of course, the bishops," I said, "you're not going to find them shoulder to shoulder on this issue."
Now explain that. Who were the main players that caused so much grief for the pro-life movement that the pro-life movement had no idea about, and eventually we learned?
You'd better to ask me about the ones that were so solid, because the rest of, when I referred to Archbishop Pocock in 1973 discussing with the Parliamentary Pro-Life Caucus the removal of Catholic charities from the United Way campaign, that was a gutsy move on his part.
It was.
And he didn't have the support of his fellow bishops on it.
Yeah.
And he didn't have the support of the priests of the archdiocese on it. But he had the guts to stand up. Other priests and whatnot called him Phil the Pill because he thought that he was soft on the birth control issue. And he took, when I talked to him at one point about the Humanae Vitae and the Winnipeg statement by the Canadian hierarchy, he said, "Well, I relied upon the people that were there, Gregory Baum, and he named about 5 of them." Well, I said, "Okay." And then I learned that none of the 5 of them was pro-life. They were all objecting to Pope Paul VI, the wonderful encyclical Humanae Vitae.
Gregory Baum is a parity at the Second Vatican Council. Tell us about him.
Gregory Baum started up as born Jewish, became Catholic, became a pre-Catholic priest, left the priesthood to marry a former nun, and wrote a book about how he, during that time, he was involved in a homosexual relationship with his homosexual lover. So that's one of the people that had impressed Archbishop Pocock with his knowledge on all these issues. So it was, I have an expression, and it comes from my Irish grandfather, and he says, trust in God, all others pay cash. So if I disagreed with a bishop or an archbishop, a cardinal, or even the Pope, and people would say to me, what do you think of this? I'd say, well, I actually pray to his boss. And that's how I get through it all. It's, I know what is involved here. And of course, around all of these politicians, around all of these clergy, are people they trust.
Yes.
Because they trust them for various reasons. And so when it comes to this issue, they trust them on this issue as well, only to find out too late that those people are not on side.
What advice would you give to a newly appointed bishop when he goes in to take over the diocese, knowing that what happens in every diocese?
I warned them. I said to one archbishop, he just been made archbishop of a big city in Canada, and I said, what about the people around you? He said, oh, they're all solid. And I said, no, they're not. He said, what? I said, no. When I presented papers to your predecessor and went back to see him, he said, give me a month or so to go over this stuff. I went back, and he said to his staff, bring me in that file from Campaign Life, will you please? And we waited for the longest time. He said, bring in that file. And I said, they've thrown it in the garbage. Yeah. And he said, no, they'd never do that. Well, they couldn't find the file. They'd thrown it in the garbage. And then all kinds of stuff you had to put up with too, which provided the opposition with a reason why their archbishop would not support us. And I can remember on one occasion, the archbishop in a very large city in Canada said, I want to talk to you. I said, that's fine. I'll be glad to come and meet with you. So when I phoned his secretary to set up an appointment, about 6 hours away from Toronto, where our main office was, the secretary said, no, he's coming to you. I said, what? Oh, okay, so he's got business in Toronto, so he's coming there. So I met him at the airport, and I asked him, what's your schedule for today? And he said, to be with you. I said, what? He said, I'm going to be with you all day. So whatever you're doing, I'm doing. Okay, so I did what I was doing, and people were shocked. They went to see a very strong supporter who was dying in the hospital, and I brought him in, and I said, I'd like you to meet the Archbishop of, and she said, and she told her family then, Jim Hughes brought this Archbishop in to see me, and she died a little while later. And
that was of a major diocese.
It was a major diocese, and as a matter of fact, in my role as Vice President of the International Right to Life Federation, we had a conference set up for Brazil, and it turned out that was the first year of COVID, so we had to do it by Zoom or whatever, and they wanted one clergy from Canada to speak, so he's the one that I suggested, and he kindly did the job from the clergy side. Now, they're not all the people in the International Right to Life Federation are not all Catholics. Yeah. They're made up of various church communities, etc. And, when the late Nellie Gray started the March for Life in Washington, D.C., after Roe v. Wade. Yeah. After Roe v. Wade, she had a meeting in her apartment or her home in Washington, D.C., and she said all the people there were Democrats, and all the men were members of the Knights of Columbus. And now most of the people there were Republicans, and at least half the leaders were from various other religious backgrounds. It was amazing to see, and I loved working with them all in the time that I was the president of CLC, and I'm sure Jeff Gunnarsson, the current leader, finds the same thing with them all. They're all inspiring, all the things they're prepared to do and the courageous things they're prepared to do.
Well, to work with Nellie Gray, what had to be your views on abortion?
Nellie was just like Laura MacArthur in The Farm Girl from New Brunswick, who was the president of Toronto Right to Life. She said, "You're not a compromiser, are you?" I said, "No, I'm not a compromiser." She said, "Good. Well, why don't you have a march in Canada, in your nation's capital?" I said, "Well, it's so much work, and we're doing all this political work too and everything else." And she said, "Don't be a wimp. You could do it." And I said, "Yeah, I guess we could." So we did, and we've had it for 25 years, I guess, now. And it was Nellie Gray that was the catalyst behind that. All these strong women that I've been associated with, they say, "Oh, men are the strongest." Like heck they are. The women are the strongest. They've always been there. Look at the foot of the cross. And I mean, even John tried to escape, and Mary Magdalene got him by the ear and tugged him back. So, I mean, it's amazing to be with them all and to educate them all. But when you talk about the women, you have to talk about the people behind the people that you see publicized. I mean, Joe Scheidler's wife Ann, and Jack Wilkie's wife Barbara, and Judy Brown's husband Paul, and all of those. That's just in the States, and right around the world, the people that I've met. The husbands, Jack Landolt in Toronto with Gwen as the running one, and Bill MacArthur with Laura MacArthur, and Winifred Prestwich's sister Alice held the home together while Winifred went and did all these things. So
they were all supported by another very close person, usually a husband or wife, and sometimes a sister.
Absolutely, and it was amazing because that's what this is all about. It's a team.
Yes.
And when I would say the pro-life family, some people would get upset and say, "No, it's not a family." I say, "You sure? It sure is. It's a family." I've slept in the basements of different pro-lifers across the country from one area to another. I can still remember in Vancouver, in part of British Columbia, Mary Wagner, this heroic rescuer, etc., who spent time in jail for the unborn. When she was just a kid, I was there because her father was the head of Campaign Life in British Columbia. And I can still remember one morning I was sleeping on a cot in their basement, and I could hear the mother yell, "Don't let the dog downstairs, Mr. Hughes is sleeping in the basement." And so I thought, oh my God, panic, don't move, that sort of thing. Those types of people, they've been phenomenal.
Yeah.
The people in Business for Life have been phenomenal. For the last 35 years or so, 30 years, whatever it is. And they're still going strong, still supporting the pro-life effort in the way those business people could do it. Putting ads in various publications, their financial donations, and being strong in their desire to do whatever they could.
What's the common characteristic of these people?
They have strong faith.
Mm-hmm.
There have been exceptions with people with no faith whatsoever who have come out of the woodwork, and people that I've met just sitting in a restaurant having breakfast on a Saturday morning, and a guy on the next table talking to people at another table about some hockey team and whatnot, and he said, "Now I can't remember who the right winger on that line was," and so I piped up and said, "So and so," and he'd say, "Yeah, that's who it was." And so we're in a conversation with people at two different tables, and he said, "Have I seen you before?" I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Are you that pro-life guy?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm pro-life too." And I said, "Oh." He said, "My name's Chrétien, but I'm no relation to the Prime Minister." But he said, "I'm not of his faith either. I don't have any faith. I don't believe in God really and whatnot." Here's a guy that was solidly pro-life.
Yeah.
But he didn't belong to any faith community. But the people in the United States that I've met, the people in Britain that I've met, where they've said, "Mr. Hughes, I'm not a Roman Catholic, but could you explain Teddy Kennedy to us?"
Yes. Oh, that's a tough one.
Well, it's called Camelot, and that's all I can tell you. I said, "Oh, yes, I understand." And
well, explain some of the Americans the notable Americans that you've worked with over the years, going right back to the very beginning when you and I met even.